Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is the briefing. In October last year, Xi Jinping secured another 5 years as General Secretary of the CCP. It's a seat of power he's occupied since 2012. In the same month, The Economist released The Prince, a podcast that sheds light on what fuels the ideology and politics of China's ruler. The podcast has been very well received. Xi's third term? Less so. In November, he faced student protests of his zero-COVID policy. In December, he scrapped the policy and at least 72,000 people died of Omicron. Hong Kong and Taiwan continue to be a thorn in his side, and now pensioners are protesting in Wuhan. We polled 12 of our journalist fellows about what the greatest threat to Xi Jinping's power has been over the past 5 months. 58% said student protests, 16.7% said COVID deaths, 25% said Hong Kong unrest. Joining us to discuss her podcast is Economist journalist and host, Sue-Lin Wong. That's the briefing. Let's begin.
Well, hello and welcome to another Global Journalism Seminar here at the Reuters Institute of Journalism. As you just saw, this was a brief introduction to our guest today. Sue-Lin Wong is a China correspondent at The Economist. She recently released a podcast series called The Prince, about the life of Xi Jinping. This quite fantastic 8-parter is a biography of sorts, and it really weaves together the beginning of Xi's third term, what starts there, but traces a lot of the political history of modern China as well, and is, not my words, an astonishing piece of work, not just in its novelistic storytelling, but in its sheer repertorial gumption. That's one of the rave reviews that Sue-Lin's work has got. Joining me today is the series' host, originally from Australia, Sue-Lin Wong, who is with The Economist, joins in to talk about this podcast and really the host of folks that she's been speaking to while threading this together. Sue-Lin, such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for doing a little mini podcast of your own, jumping onto a flight that was delayed and then wading through traffic and rain to get here and speak to us and our fellows. Really appreciate it. Welcome to our show.
No worries at all. Thanks very much for having me.
So let me start by asking you about this rather whirlwind last 5 months, Sulin. Did you see it coming, the kind of response you've had to your podcast?
No, really, not at all. I think, last year we spent many months working on The Prince, and we had no idea of how it would be received, if anyone at all would listen to it. So it's been very gratifying to see how it's been received, amongst a whole range of people, China watchers all over the world, in sort of Washington, DC and Brussels and various other capitals, but also audio people, people who work on podcasts have also sort of reached out. So that has been really nice. And perhaps what's been the most gratifying has been the response inside China, where listeners have had to actually scale the Great Firewall in order to listen to the series because it's not freely available inside the firewall. And yet we've had an anonymous group of Chinese internet users they've translated it into Chinese on YouTube. And there's this very famous Taiwanese podcast that did 5 episodes sort of talking about The Prince and in Chinese and in Taiwan, where, they can more freely discuss Xi Jinping. So, it's been a very surprising experience, a very surprising response. But obviously, I'm really pleased. I guess journalists just want our work to be read or listened to. And, I think this story is also a very important story. Obviously, I would say that, but I do genuinely believe, we should all be trying to learn more about China. We should all be trying to learn more about how the Chinese Communist Party really operates, and who Xi Jinping is, and, how China, the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping all interact together, and how Xi Jinping has changed the party and how the party has shaped Xi Jinping.
It's interesting you say that. And first, always a great sign when people are burning up their VPN connections to get access to something, that it's a hit. It's interesting that you say that it's important to know Xi Jinping's story as opposed to knowing the entire communist model and structure within the country itself, because that's been talked about enough. Let me pick your reporter's brain a little bit to understand what you were thinking of when you thought about creating a podcast like this, why you thought it was important to tell his story versus any other party leaders.
Well, I must, the full disclosure, it actually was not my idea. It was our editor's idea. She was very keen for a podcast series on Xi Jinping. And, when there was sort of a discussion internally about whether or not we wanted to do this, I think among the China correspondents, myself included, our initial reaction was, could we maybe pick an easier subject? The way I describe trying to make a podcast about Xi Jinping is, imagine being asked to make a podcast series about Joe Biden, but not being able to go to America or speak to any Americans on the ground there because it's too dangerous for them to speak to you freely. And, you also would be putting them at huge risk. And that's basically what trying to make a podcast series about Xi Jinping is like. Nevertheless, we pressed on. And, I really think in hindsight, it was very much an excellent idea. Over the past 10 years, China has really, really changed. It's become a lot more authoritarian, much less free. And a lot of that is to do with the country's leader, Xi Jinping. The future of not only 1.4 billion people, but many, many more people beyond China's borders hinges on the mind of this one man. And yet we all know so little about him that I think sort of any contribution that's possible to try to better understand who he is, where he came from, what he experienced as a child, what happened to him as a teenager, how he rose through the ranks of the Chinese Communist Party, and what he's done to China since he came to power. In 2012, but also, what might happen to China going forward because he could stay in power for a very, very long time. I think, all of that is a very important story to tell.
So let's work backwards from the point that you cannot enter China. Tell us a little bit about that, and then tell us about how you went about mapping this, because really, I think what's overwhelming, Sulin, is the number of people you spoke to and the variety of folks that you've spoken to. How did you map that? How did you ensure that you were protecting their identities and their safety as well while putting this together?
Yeah, so just for some context, I was hired by The Economist in mid-2020, and I was supposed to be based in Beijing, but this was sort of, really at the start of COVID, and it was very, very difficult to get visas. And so I sat in Hong Kong hoping that my journalist visa to Beijing would come through. And, it was a very, very interesting time to be in Hong Kong. I had been there covering the big pro-democracy protests in 2019. And, we were watching this once free and open city turning into a police state. And so I was trying to cover China from Hong Kong. And then in September of 2021, when my Hong Kong visa was up for renewal, I got this disturbing letter from the Hong Kong authorities asking for all kinds of information, including every single article I had ever written about Hong Kong. I didn't really feel safe to stay, given that the party had just imposed a draconian national security law on the city. And so I packed a suitcase, shut my apartment door, and got on a flight to London, where The Economist is headquartered. Because at the time, actually, I couldn't get home to Australia. Borders were closed. I'm not sure if you all remember late 2021. So yeah, and then I actually never went back, because soon after that, I found out that my visa wasn't renewed by the Hong Kong authorities. And then it was around that time we started discussing internally this project about making a podcast about Xi Jinping. But it was, as you mentioned, a huge challenge because we had reporting the story. So perhaps it might be helpful for me to just take a step back here and talk a little bit about what the podcast really tried to do. I'm just going to assume some viewers haven't listened. So basically, we were trying to think about how do we tell the story of Xi Jinping's life, but also weave in the story of the Chinese Communist Party and modern Chinese society. And I think for a lot of China journalists, we would have loved to make a podcast on the Chinese Communist Party. You know, it's got over 100 million people. It's the biggest political organization in the world. It has many, many more members than the population of Germany. It in and of itself is very worthy of a 8-part podcast series. But, you know, my colleagues, especially in the audio team, sort of were also saying that it's more compelling to sort of tell the story of modern China and tell the story of the Chinese Communist Party through an individual. And, you know, there is no one better to sort of channel that story through than Xi Jinping. So, you know, Xi Jinping was born into Chinese Communist Party royalty. His dad was the right-hand man of Mao Zedong, fought alongside him in the revolution. And so when Xi Jinping was born, he, you know, lived in a very fancy compound. He went to top schools. He ate relatively good food at a time when millions of Chinese were starving. You know, his apartment compound had butlers and nannies and security guards. But when he was 9 years old, his father was purged by Mao Zedong and his whole world was turned upside down. So this was at a time when Mao Zedong had unleashed sort of these mobs on society, and they sort of beat, tortured, killed many, many Chinese people. It was a very, very traumatic period in Chinese history. And Xi Jinping has written about how he himself was given 5 minutes to live by these Red Guards, and he genuinely feared for his life. And eventually, sort of the Cultural Revolution moved into a new stage, and Mao Zedong decided he wanted to send millions of urban youth to the countryside to learn from peasants. And Xi Jinping was one of these millions of young Chinese people. So he ended up getting sent to this very poor village, you know, with no electricity. Everyone there were peasants. He lived in a cave for several years. I don't think there are many other world leaders right now who can put living in a cave when I was a teenager on their resume. And he witnessed and experienced this very pivotal and catastrophic moment in Chinese history. And I think, you know, the lesson he drew from that chaos, you know, and this was a time when, you know, he writes about how he didn't have enough to eat for months. He eventually saw this raw chunk of meat and he ate it raw because he hadn't eaten meat in such a long time. You know, he really couldn't hack the hard labor in the countryside. He tried to escape back to see his family and in the city, and his mother refused to take him in because she was worried for her own safety. So there was this very, very sort of tumultuous time. And when China sort of came out of that, I think many, many millions of Chinese were very traumatized by what had happened and, you know, wanted nothing to do with the Chinese Communist Party and even nothing to do with China. And that's why, you know, many, many Chinese of that generation left China and went to places like the UK. But Xi Jinping drew a very different lesson. And it wasn't that the Chinese Communist Party in and of itself was bad. It was that the party had lost control during those years. And if he ever rose to the top, he would try to make sure that the party never lost control again. So that was kind of the starting point for our series. And so we had to think about, you know, how do we tell this story? How do we get audio? How do we do interviews? And so for those early years of his life, we relied a lot on video archives. And there are some extraordinarily frank interviews that Xi Jinping and his family have done before he took power. And so we used a lot of that. And then we had to get really creative. Like, we knew that there was no way that Xi Jinping or any of his friends and family would do an interview with us. So, you know, one way to tell the story is to find someone else who had very similar life experiences to Xi Jinping. And we ended up finding the daughter of Mao Zedong's personal secretary. And Mao Zedong's personal secretary was purged when his daughter was 9 years old. And so we use her as a way to talk about, you know, what it was like as a kid to be born into immense privilege and then lose it all and be sent to the countryside and, you know, not be able to go to school and have your whole world turned upside down. So that was one of many ways we tried to sort of get around the constraints of reporting. And then in subsequent episodes, we ended up trying to find people who had experienced really important moments in modern Chinese history. So we found a villager who was very involved in a very prominent protest that sort of garnered international attention over corruption in a village. He now drives an Uber in New York, so we were able to speak to him. I drove around in his Uber. We found a Chinese censor who worked for Weibo, which is China's equivalent of Twitter, and eventually moved to America and now tries to speak out about how Chinese censorship works. So we had to get very creative in all the different ways we tried to report the podcast. And just the other, sorry, I can talk about all the different ways we did this, but I won't. Just one final example is, I worked with some very, very talented producers and a sound designer. And one of our producers, Sam Colbert, he managed to find someone who was protesting in 1989 in China. This was, during these huge pro-democracy protests across the country, most famously in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And he was able to find someone who was protesting very near where Xi Jinping was posted at the time in the southern Chinese province of Fujian. And this person now lives overseas and refused to have their voice appear in the podcast, but we ended up figuring out a workaround, and we got Sam Colbert, our producer, to tell us what this guy told at these student protests.
Slightly scratchy line that we've got you there, but I think we got much of what you said, Sulin, and I think you're absolutely right. The magic of what you weave together in terms of the sound production really does come through in the podcast. I want to sort of toggle between the past and the present, in a way. As you said, it is a remarkably unique childhood where your own parent turns on you, and not just on one, but many occasions, as documented. There's almost this Machiavellian overtone as well, better to be feared than loved. And you do sort of make that interesting point, saying he's probably not at the peak of where he would like to be in terms of domination over the party, over the country. What leads you to say that, and what sort of form and shape do you think this domination might take?
So for many decades, China has been ruled by a very cautious collective leadership of people at the very highest ranks of the Chinese Communist Party. And, since the brutal reign of Mao Zedong, there was sort of this unspoken rule that leaders would rule for 2 5-year terms and then make way for the next leader. But what we saw at the end of 2022 was, that go out the window, and Xi Jinping's 10 years were up in November of 2022, and he's staying on. And he also hasn't named a successor, which is also really breaking with convention. So, who knows? And it's a big question. How long will he stay on for? 5 years, 10 years, the rest of his life? No one really knows. And I think what was also really striking about this big party congress that we just saw China have was a lot of his allies were promoted to the very highest ranks of the party. It used to be that there were, many different factions vying for power, and a Chinese leader would have to balance those factional interests. Now it's basically just the Xi Jinping faction. So we've seen him really consolidate power. And, given this broader context, I think it's fair to argue that, we haven't seen everything from him, and he could be around for a very long time to come.
And I think that's something you mentioned in the second or third episode, where you say, if you remember one thing from the podcast, know that CCP refers to the fall of the Soviet Union as proof of the need to maintain control of the military. That would and does send shivers down the neighboring regions. It has a very strong geopolitical context as well. Given the amount and the number of people that you've spoken to, what do you reckon the next 4 or 5 years might look like under this leader? Will it be the one China, sort of motto that he's going to go very strongly with? Will it be economic domination, something that they have enjoyed for a long time? Will it be something else?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to predict. I think broadly we're seeing continuity of, what he tried to do in the first 10 years. Obviously, China faces a lot of challenges. It's trying to come out of zero COVID. Its economy is very shaky. There are huge geopolitical tensions that it faces, particularly with America. But I mean, just going back to the quote that you mentioned, I think it was episode 4, I wanted to really signpost something I thought was important, partially because it's, I think just good journalistic practice, but also there was a lot of content in the Prince, and it would be unrealistic to assume that everyone remembers everything. But, the one thing I thought was very important to try to remember was that the fall of the Soviet Union haunts the Chinese Communist Party to this very day. And that was why I actually, we were in the studio just recording that line. And I said, actually, can we just tweak it a little bit and say, if there is one thing you remember from this series, let it be this. And I think that was for a couple of reasons. So firstly, in the West, the fall of the Soviet Union was really celebrated, and it was considered this wonderful thing. And I think there is sometimes China journalists will bring their own worldview and their own assumptions to covering China. And that was something I really didn't want us to do with the Prince. I wanted us to try and understand Xi Jinping and try to understand the Chinese Communist Party on their own terms. Now, of course, we can be very critical in our analysis and sort of our evaluation of what's going on. But, I think the starting point has to be to try to understand China on its own terms. And so from China's perspective, it was the fall of the Soviet Union was experienced very differently. It was considered an absolute catastrophe. And when Xi Jinping came to power, a documentary was released that millions of party members had to study about why the Soviet Union fell and what lessons the Chinese Communist Party should learn from it. And it was that the ideology in the Soviet Union was weak, and the leaders were weak, and they had lost control of their history, the narrative of their history, and they had lost control of the military. And there was an argument that, Stalin actually saw what the risks facing the Soviet Union were, and the biggest risk was corruption. And actually, when you look at what Xi Jinping has done over the past 10 years, he launched his signature anti-corruption campaign when he first came into power, and it goes on today. Millions of people have been caught up in it, and he has genuinely stamped down on corruption while also conveniently using his corruption campaign to get rid of his enemies. And he's really ramped up ideological discipline. So, whether you're a school kid in Shanghai or you work in a private business somewhere in China, you have to, study Xi Jinping thought. There's a lot more party ideology that understanding how the party views China and has done to the Communist Party and the direction that the country is heading in going forward.
Let's talk about 2 more recent events and, how you read them as someone who was piecing this podcast together. One was, of course, the public COVID protests, and it came together as almost a coalition of protests where there was a COVID protest and there were students protesting and there was an agri protest. And there was this marked difference between the seasoned China watchers versus the rest of social media on how they were reading this. There was this social media universe said, that's it, that's the end of Xi Jinping, and this is going to be that cataclysmic moment where all hell breaks loose. And there were seasoned China watchers saying, look, we've seen protests before. You can't call it. How were you processing this event? And did it look like it was indeed his sort of toughest test?
I mean, I just was glued to social media following what was going on. And, I think it was incredibly brave and courageous and inspiring to see people taking to the streets. In China, it was really something we hadn't seen since 1989 in the pro-democracy protests. So I think that is incredibly important to note. But yeah, I must say that, even when the protest started and I started seeing speculation that this would be the end of the party and this would be the end of Xi Jinping, I just don't think that is how to think about it. And hopefully the Prince provides some frameworks for the way to actually think about it. So one thing we tried to do was, once we get to Xi Jinping taking power in the series, we look at how he seizes control of the Chinese Communist Party first, in that episode where we really look at the Soviet Union. And then in subsequent episodes, we basically are looking at, okay, he's seized control of the Chinese Communist Party. How does he now seize control of China? And the reality is that increasingly the party has very, very powerful censorship, propaganda, and surveillance machines. And in order for those protests, those extraordinary protests we saw at the end of last year, in order for them to truly be a threat to the Chinese Communist Party, what would have had to happen was we would have had to see organizing across China in multiple cities. And the other thing is, I would note, while these protests were extraordinary, it was, a couple of hundred, a couple of thousand people in a country of 1.4 billion people. So the number of protesters was really, really sort of quite small compared to the population of China. So what we would have had to see for it to really, really pose a threat, I think, is for the protests to be very, very widespread, millions of people taking to the streets with the support of Chinese Communist Party members at the very, very highest level of the party, who had an in with the Chinese military, which serves the party. Unlike many other militaries around the world, the Chinese military is there to serve the Chinese Communist Party. And we would have had to see these millions of protesters circumvent the censorship machine, the propaganda machine, and the surveillance machine. And we didn't see any of that. And in fact, what has now happened, tragically, is that many of these very brave protesters have been detained, have been disappeared, because these machines that the Chinese Communist Party has built and has at its fingertips are so powerful that they were able to round up many, many of the protesters who took to the streets.
The second sort of much chattered about event was a publicly broadcast senior party meeting where one former senior party member was very publicly lifted and dragged out from that large auditorium, while Xi Jinping himself seemed quite unaffected, didn't even turn to respond. And there was so much talk and analysis about what he was trying to communicate with that and what the message was that the larger public should take away. Did you happen to look at that? And did you sort of get any input from the folks you spoke with about what that was about? And I'm hoping your internet hasn't frozen completely so we can get you back online. For those who
well, that was another moment.
Okay, you're back. Hello? Great. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. That was another moment where I was just absolutely glued to social media, glued to my computer. I probably shouldn't admit this, but I must have watched that video where Hu Jintao, the former leader of China, was escorted off the stage at the party congress in front of the world's cameras. I must have watched that video 20 times or so, played it on slow motion, tried to look at it from different angles, because it was just an extraordinary scene again. So the first thing I would say is that we just don't know what happened, and we probably will never know what happened, because elite Chinese politics is a black box. There's so much we don't know. And that was something we really grappled with trying to make this podcast about Xi Jinping. You know, there's so much of his life that I still have no idea about. And there's so many things about elite Chinese politics that, you know, none of us really know about. And I actually think it's helpful if we just are open about this. I think it can lead to sort of better analysis. So first of all, we don't really know, but what is, there are a couple of interesting things about it. One, China's big political meetings like this Congress are highly curated, highly orchestrated. And Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party would have known that at that moment when Hu Jintao was unceremoniously escorted off stage, at that moment, the foreign press corps and journalists from around the world had been allowed into that big theater where this Congress was being held, this meeting was being held. So they would have known that, you know, the world's eyes were looking at what was happening. The other thing is that was notable was that no one really reacted on stage. And, you know, if your former boss seemed to be having some kind of problems, whether it was health problems or something else, I don't know, I think it feels like human instinct would be to try to, you know, get up and go and help them. And yet we didn't really see anyone do that, except one of the other senior members of the party who was sitting right next to him. And I think that is very telling. You know, everyone just sort of stared straight ahead and seemed to be trying to take their cue from Xi Jinping, which indicates to me that there's a lot of fear, even at the very highest levels of the party, over, you know, what might happen if anyone steps out of line, if anyone questions Xi Jinping himself. But again, this is all speculation. And then the final thing I would note is that Hu Jintao has been known to belong to a particular faction called the Communist Youth League, and it was expected that some of his proteges would be promoted to the highest levels of the party during that Congress. And what was notable was none of them were promoted, and actually, you know, one was even demoted. So that also just goes to show how much Xi Jinping has really consolidated his power. But it was an extraordinary sight. Yes, definitely. I agree.
You know, so much of your podcast is such a fantastic construction audio wise, and you know, in terms of an experience, you cooking alongside your mom, you know, all these interesting stories that you weaved into to the larger story. But there is the very real threat and fear of what you're doing. There are very real consequences to people's safety and your own. And I think within that, perhaps the most difficult one for someone to listen to was episode 5 about a whistleblower, or at least for a journalist to listen to, He Who Shall Not Be Named. As a journalist, which, you know, where were the points where you had to sit down and say, okay, I need to take a minute here. This is a lot to process, and there are genuine consequences here for people, and I have to be mindful of that.
Yeah, I think I do that every day of my career as a China journalist, which started, you know, many years before making this podcast. And I just think China reporting is really, really tough on many levels, including the level you just alluded to, which is, you know, how do we protect our sources, and how do we make sure that we keep everyone safe? Because, you know, no story is worth one of our sources going to jail for. I used to cover North Korea from the Chinese side of the border, and so for, you know, I would be based in Beijing, but I would travel to all kinds of towns along the Chinese border with North Korea. And it was a really, really fascinating beat. But it was so challenging because anywhere you go in China as a reporter, the minute you check into a hotel, the police are notified by the hotel. And very often they will show up, escort you to the police station, question you, and then take you to the train station or airport and ask you to leave. Or you'll be out, on the road near the border of North Korea, and there will be roadblocks and you sort of, again, be taken off to a police station, held for many hours. I remember sometimes being worried that the police officers would ask to see everything on my phone. So I would go to the toilet at the police station and quickly send all my photos and my quotes to my editor in Beijing, hoping that, we'd still be able to make some kind of story out of it. And then that's just what it's like physically on the ground. And the other thing I would add is I think things have really changed since COVID and since, QR codes. And I have to defer to my colleagues for what has happened since then, because I haven't been reporting on the ground in China since mid-2020. But, that there's also all these cyber considerations, because the most commonly used app in China, WeChat, which everyone uses often for multiple hours every day, is heavily surveilled. And so as a journalist, you can't really reach out to your sources on WeChat if you're working on a sensitive story. So for this podcast on Xi Jinping, I didn't message a single Chinese contact on WeChat, which is the most used app in the whole of China. And so there's all kinds of really, really big challenges and ethical questions when trying to report something like this. So one other thing I would add is at the end of each episode in the credits, we credit some very brave people who we cannot name. And the reality is, there is absolutely no way we could have made this podcast series without the help of some very, very brave people we can't name. And so I think, it's not just about who we're interviewing on the podcast. It's also about who, what local journalists are we working with and how do we protect them?
No, absolutely. I'm going to switch out to some of the questions coming in, and there's several questions coming in. And then if there's time, I'll ask you some of mine as well. There's one that says, very interesting, Sulin. In case you're going to talk about it, I have a question. How do you see the possibility that Xi Jinping would actively support the war on Ukraine and step into the war? And what is the atmosphere in China in that regard? Are people okay with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at what the propaganda war in Ukraine, China says that it is neutral, but it's really supporting Russia. And what it's driven by is the fact that it really wants America distracted in Europe, and it doesn't want to support. I think the idea that it's going to support the West and support America in this war is just not the right way to think about it. It's pretty convenient that there is this China-Russia partnership. China has gotten a lot out of the war in Ukraine. It's benefited from Russia selling it a lot of energy. I think we could expect to see Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party continuing to sort of support Russia, even if it sort of says it's neutral. I think the idea that it might be there was some speculation early on in the war that facilitate dialogue. I just don't believe that we will see that happen.
Okay, let me switch across to our room where our fellows are waiting with their questions. Let me hop across first to Tarye, I think, who has a question. Tarye, why don't you tell us where you're from and then your question to Sulin?
Sure. Hi, I'm Tarjei from Norway. Thank you so much for an interesting presentation. I was curious about the reaction from CCP to your podcast. Whether yourself or some of your sources have experienced any problems with CCP after broadcasting the podcast, and how you are dealing with that if your sources are having problems after this.
Yeah, that about throughout the making of the podcast, and it's something that I thought a lot about, and it's something I continue to think a lot about. So far, as far as I know, there hasn't really been a reaction from the Chinese Communist Party. The Economist currently has 3 China correspondents on the ground in China, 2 in Beijing, 1 in Shanghai. So yeah, I mean, that has that's the current situation.
Hey, Matala, you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, guys. Back into the room, and can we swivel over to UC, please, who has a question?
Hello there, thank you so much for talking with us today. You mentioned that reporters from the West have a tendency of incorporating their own worldview when they are doing their China coverage instead of taking China on its own terms. And I was wondering if this was the case when the recent protests were covered, because I think in the Western media there was a lot of wishful thinking that ultimately the protests were about the people in China wanting more democratic rights and freedoms. And I would love to hear your assessments on those protests from this angle. Do you see signs of the Chinese public actively wanting a more democratic society, or is this an example of Western ideals being imposed on our reading of the situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I definitely think journalists are a dog and a bias in favor, sometimes for good reason, but I think it's really important that we're aware of those biases, so that when we do come to selecting stories and framing stories, we're doing it with great intent. Risk in all kinds of reporting, but I definitely see it a lot in China reporting. And I think, as you mentioned, there is a lot of wishful thinking that the party is going to collapse and Xi Jinping is going to be booted out when a couple of hundred people take to the streets in Shanghai. But I think sort of a more useful way to think about story like that, which absolutely should be covered, is to understand, all the ways that China with control and stability, and look at history and look at what happens to people who protest, and sort of really try and understand the tools that the party has to exert control, and sort of think about the scenario in which the party's grip on power would genuinely be threatened. So yeah, I think this is definitely something that I care a lot about. Like, how do we think about China in a rigorous way? And then how do we try to use those ways of thinking to understand what is going on now? Because I think, it's not necessarily that good reporting and good analysis is going to lead to good policy and good decisions. But I think bad reporting and bad analysis is definitely not going to lead to good policies and good decisions.
Fair point. I think that should be printed on a T-shirt for journalists from many countries. Let me go across to Natalia now, who has a question as well. Natalia.
Thank you so much for your podcast. My question is about details you provide for the audience about his past and his childhood, and sometimes it sounds like excuses. We understand his behavior better and his political approach maybe also. What do you think about such kind of side effect of the podcast when we feel kind of empathy about the main hero? And my next question, did you aim at a Chinese audience? Usually when we do projects about dictators, we serve an audience that is aware of the situation already. And it's very hard to reach the other part of the audience, other social bubble, people who are not very aware of what's going on in China, for instance. Was it possible in your case?
Sorry, can you just repeat the second part of your final question, your second question? I didn't catch it.
Yeah. Did you try to reach a Chinese audience? Was it possible in your case? Because usually when we do the project about dictatorship, about countries like China or Russia, we serve the audience which is aware about the situation already.
I see, right. Yeah, so I would Chinese audience, although I honestly think a local Chinese journalist would be Xi Jinping for a Chinese audience should be completely in Chinese. It shouldn't be in English. So we were making this, we were, The Economist is an English language publication. So it was always going to be for our listeners are in America and the UK. So we definitely had discussions about, who are we making this for? And we tried to keep that audience in mind. And I would love one day for there to be a podcast series on Xi Jinping in Chinese for Chinese people, but I probably am not the right person to make it. And I think given the political environment, unfortunately, we might be waiting a very long time for that exact podcast to exist. And then on your first question, which I think is a great one, I'm not sure if people come away after listening to the full series feeling sympathetic to Xi Jinping. I think what we were trying to do in the early episodes is make sure we didn't start getting back to sort of journalists bringing their own worldviews and their own assumptions to reporting, which, is something we were trying to avoid. I think sometimes there is a risk that journalists start with Xi Jinping is crazy, or what Xi Jinping is doing doesn't make any sense. When in fact, actually, it's not like that at all. And what he's doing makes a lot of sense if you what he's doing, clearly not. If you sort of listen to the later episodes, I think that becomes quite clear. If you read our weekly coverage, that is also quite clear. But I think what we were really trying to do is deeply understand where he's coming from and how that has shaped his thinking and how that drives him.
Unfortunately, we've got you on a really scratchy line, Sulin. So let me ask you one final question and then we'll let you run, because I know that you've gone through many, many hoops to make it for this conversation. Everyone from the product side is probably sitting in, listening to this thinking, how do I do it? How do I get the business side of podcast to work? How do I reel in an audience and create, that much traction around podcasts as a tool? It would be great to hear some of that from you. When you were sitting down and ideating with your team, what were you thinking of this from a product side? How do you make a podcast successful in this way?
Yeah, I don't really know, to be honest. I think this was clearly, one thing that struck me is clearly there's huge appetite for stories that sort of illuminate important issues. But so I think the fact we tried to tell the story of China and tell the story of the party through Xi Jinping and through individual Chinese people's stories received. But yeah, I don't know if there is a secret source. Yeah.
That's the number one rule of a journalist. Don't reveal your special source, right? But it's been great chatting to you, Sulin. I know that your mandate has opened up. You're covering a lot more in Southeast Asia, and perhaps you will find, if not similarly challenging, but equally challenging countries and regimes and issues to cover. You have all our best wishes. We're looking forward to another smashing podcast from you, and we're all going to be listening in. But thank you very much for joining in today and for speaking to us and to our fellows. And we wish you luck and Godspeed.
Thank you very much.
Folks, we'll be back again soon enough with another guest, but I think this one was really special, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed chatting to Sulin.